Welcome to the HerbWorks podcast featuring Roger Drummer, the formulator at herbworks.com. An educator in the field of nutrition and Chinese herbalism, Roger has a unique ability to keep things simple by taking all the guesswork out of complicated health issues. HerbWorks is committed to helping you improve your health and enhance your life through herbs and common sense.
Hi, this is Roger Drummer from HerbWorks, and I am really excited today because I'm doing something new. And so I want to introduce Dr. Ann Barter, who runs the Alternative Family Medicine and Chiropractic Center in Longmont, Colorado. So hello, Dr. Ann.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to talking today.
I'm excited to find out a lot from you today. So
all right.
I want you to know that I love functional medicine. You know, my background is Chinese medicine, but it's very similar because in Chinese medicine, you're trying to find out what's actually going on instead of just treating something. And that's the same idea with functional medicine, don't you think?
Absolutely the same premise. I think we're all trying to get to the root cause and figure out how to put the body back in homeostasis.
You know, this is what kind of throws people off when they see someone in Chinese herbology. They think they go in looking for something for a symptom, and they're just trying to see where you're mostly messed up and where your imbalance is, and they try to correct it because your body knows how to fix things.
Totally. I completely agree. I feel like we're just fixing symptoms at this point versus really trying to get to the root cause of what the problem is. And I mean, when you look at labs and when you look at people's everything that's going on, when you just take a general like CBC or CMP, which is what your primary care runs when you go into a clinic, just taking that information and looking at it, there are so many things that actually need to be corrected that are completely in normal range because people are already having all sorts of symptoms across the board, which you can attest to, which you see all the time, but they're pushed around and told that everything is normal. And the reason for that is that how they come up with those reference ranges is very narrow. Well, actually, it's not narrow. It's actually very broad. And so they just take a culmination of people that have been running the same labs in your area, and that's where those reference ranges come from. So it's just basically a standard deviation of the population, which means you're compared to a bunch of other sick people, and that's why you have symptoms.
I love that idea. Right? I love it. You know, one time, I know how they're locked into these normal numbers. One time I went in and complaining of low sex drive, and this is back when 10, 12 years ago, and my testosterone was 1 point above what's considered low or abnormal, so I was considered normal. And they didn't even want to talk to me. Right? I was sitting there going, you've got to be kidding me. 1 point.
Wow. And, and the funny thing with that is, the testosterone too, I mean, the reference range on that is really, really big. It's like 300 to 1,000, right? And men that have testosterone, like 350, they are just exhausted, no sex drive, can't build muscle mass, can't gain weight, just don't have, they do not feel good. They have aches and pains. They don't sleep well, on and on and on, right? Which you can.
So it must be considered normal to be weak, tired, and have no sex drive.
Right. I mean, what's one of the most common complaints you see coming in? I mean, it's a lot of those things, right?
Yeah, it's all those things. Tiredness is what people will admit to right away.
Yeah, initially, right? And then the sex drive slips in, right? And then people then admit that they have no libido and don't want to work out and can't do anything, right? And just want to sit down and sit in front of the TV at night.
Yeah, and you know what was exciting about having you on today is because I want people to know you're actually a chiropractor who's trained in functional medicine, and I love chiropractic. I'm one of those few people that have been going to chiropractors now for almost 20 years regularly.
Very cool.
And so I love it. In fact, the best thing that ever happened to me was having the Chinese herb shop where I was apprenticing was right next to a chiropractor who loved to drink Chinese herbs. So I made him drinks, and he adjusted me 3 times a week. I thought that was like heaven for 2 years, right? I just loved it. I just loved it. And it's such a difference in my health. I really learned from that experience how being wired properly influences everything that goes on in your body.
Because we know our complaints are not just, they're not only structural, they're not only emotional, and they're not only biochemical. I mean, we're all of those things at one time, right? So, right, I mean, you have to address the whole person. That's why I think our current way that we're doing medicine isn't really serving a lot of people. That's why people are spending so much money out of pocket to get answers and not going through their insurance, right? Because we're 100% a cash practice. And we just try to do the best work and get to the root cause as fast as we can. And we're pretty busy. So we really, really love to get to the root cause of what's going on with folks. And
so your practice is based on a monthly fee? And then no, it's not. Okay. All right. Nope. I know there's different
pay for services
clinics
when they need it. Okay. Yeah, that's a concierge medicine practice theme. We haven't done that. Because everybody's at different stages with the care itself.
Right.
We treat when people need to come in and what they need. So initially at the beginning of care, there tends to be a lot going on. We have a complaint sheet, and most people will have 7 to 10 complaints that they want to address. Like, for example, constipation, fatigue, low sex drive is very popular. Weight loss is, again, very popular. Let's see here. Those are kind of the big ones. But yeah, bloating is another huge one across the board. So those are gray area symptoms that don't really match up to much, but as an overall, someone doesn't feel good. I've seen women that look like they're 6 months pregnant and they just cannot get any answers. And it's just bloating. It's pretty simple. You just have to figure out what's going on in the gut and address it. So,
right. So today we're going to kind of concentrate on something I have to admit, I am not an expert in, and that is thyroid issues. And, I think that this is one of those things, because I've been in the health field since the 80s, that kind of came up almost 15, 20 years ago. It was one of those trends where they're just starting to see that it seemed like every woman had a thyroid issue, right? And then you thought at first, well, that's just something that's popular these days in the health industry, but it never went away. That seems to be the major issue. And can you talk a little bit about that and how you came to really focus on that?
Yeah, I think, being a chiropractor, I would see people a lot for pain or discomfort or aches and pains. And my practice has always been a last-ditch effort. So people show up to my practice when nothing else works. I don't know how we came to that, but that's basically what we are. And so I would get these patients that had been everywhere. They had been to their primary care. They had been to other chiropractors. They had pretty much done everything, and they were hopeless. And so what I ended up seeing, like, for example, for structural problems, like I would see people that had moving aches and pains. They would have a ton of headaches. And, for example, they would get a chiropractic adjustment, and it would last for a day. And these headaches would be back and be debilitating. And so I started just investigating and doing lab work. And I found in a lot of primarily women, you said the key word, a lot of women, it's primarily women, would have something going on with their thyroid. And then once you got down to it, they would also be cold. They would have trouble losing weight. They would have low sex drive. When you looked at the rest of their lab work, they would have elevated cholesterol. But when you actually put it together, the big driver was thyroid, most of the time autoimmune thyroid, or Hashimoto's, which is low functioning autoimmune thyroid. So that's how I came to see it, was just that's initially what walked into my practice, and they wanted help with all these other conditions. So it just continually kept on coming in. And so I needed to learn the ins and outs of how to treat thyroid functionally. So that's basically what I ended up doing. So that's how I came to learn about it.
So with thyroid issues, what I'm also hearing a lot is that most of it is tied into autoimmune conditions.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I see a lot of. Initially, the stats a couple years ago were with all the low-functioning thyroid. So, for example, low-functioning thyroid is when you run that TSH. It's the screening test that is commonly run, and they'll say your thyroid is normal or high or low. But there are some other markers that you can run that will tell you if you have autoimmune disease to your thyroid. The primary one for Hashimoto's is TPO. And most of the time that is not run as a screening, and it's just, if the TSH is normal, they tell you you're normal. If the TSH is low, they tell you, or I'm sorry, if the TSH is high, they'll tell you that you have hypothyroid. But they don't ever screen to see if maybe you have autoimmunity, because the treatment in the medical field is the same. They believe that they're treating the thyroid gland, but what is actually going on is when you have any sort of autoimmune disease, it's not really a thyroid problem. It's actually an immune system issue, right? Because your body is attacking the gland.
Right. And what is usually causing that, do you think, is the root cause of that autoimmune issue? Is it varied from person to person, or is there a general category that kind of falls into?
Yeah. One thing that I have seen constant with people has been all of them have had a pretty severe case of mono. Mono is a virus, right, that is basically called Epstein-Barr. And so when you run the lab work, a lot of these people have pretty big Epstein-Barr infections currently. I don't know if that's the only cause. When you also take a history, you'll see that, the patient has been under stress, which maybe gave their immune system enough time to ramp up for the Epstein-Barr to really be opportunistic and rise up. So stress tends to be a common complaint. Again, it's primarily women. The personality type I see with these women, they tend to be go-getters. They tend to run companies. They tend to do everything for everybody else, and tend to take care of themselves last. They're really, really hard workers. And I think they push maybe themselves too far. The other thing that we see is sometimes after, for example, some sort of physical trauma, suddenly it'll manifest itself, like a car accident being a stressful event. That can manifest. I see that less often. Some people are sensitive to environmental exposures. That's another one. And then food sensitivities can be another one. A lot of times, wheat is a big sensitivity / gluten. In thyroid cases, patients tend to be really, really sensitive to it. But I think it's a multitude of all of these factors kind of tied up, and their immune system just loses self-regulation, which is what an autoimmune disease is. What have you seen? Have you seen anything with that? It's
kind of interesting. Back when I was practicing with a lot of clients coming in when I'm working in LA area, is that you didn't have all this access to testing that they have now in functional medicine. Mm-hmm. And what they were presenting with was what you just said. It was always high performance people who were burned out, fried, coming in. They were manifesting all these symptoms of not only thyroid, but what they call Jing deficiency or yin deficiency. And so they were really burned out and needed some substance put back in their body, and then to regulate their immune function a bit, which we always relied on combining yin tonics with reishi mushroom, because reishi mushroom at that time was the number one herb in in our little pharmacopoeia for regulating thyroid because it had a direct effect on it, yet it was also an immune system tonic you can give someone with an autoimmune condition because it regulates as opposed to stimulating anything. So that was kind of how we approached that, looking at their lifestyle, how burned out they were, and replenishing them to try and get their body up to a point where it would start to regulate its own function.
This podcast is brought to you by Herbworks, specializing in stress and brain essentials. Check out Roger's other articles and videos at herbworks.com. While you're there, take a look at our natural herbal-based product line for energy, stress, immunity, and sleep. Now back to Roger.
What did you also see? Did you see anything with adrenal function as well?
Well, that fits right in with the concept of Jing and Yin tonics in Chinese medicine. Right. It's all about restoring kidney function. In fact, the main drive of our whole store, our little setup was Jing deficiency, which I always look at stress, ruining your adrenal function, then everything else goes off. Once one gland becomes weak, the whole system starts to go off. And so we try to build up adrenal Jing and relieve their stress. Because if you don't calm the nervous system, then the glands cannot rebuild. They never go into the phase where the body signals them to recharge. So that was really our whole approach to most of those issues.
And that's 100% too what we're seeing in the functional medicine piece. I mean, these people are so depleted. They're just completely burned out. They have hormone problems like female reproductive hormone problems. They have complete adrenal fatigue. They're completely burned out. They have digestive issues. They can't lose weight. They're cold all the time. They have a lot of hair loss. I mean, everything. You have to treat the digestive function all the way up to the neurotransmitter so that they can actually feel good again. And, you know, we put them on, I don't know what if you guys did this, but we will do a pretty strong elimination diet just to see what they're reactive to and sensitive to for 30 days. And then we'll slowly reincorporate food back in as we build up their system, because we're trying to remove anything inflammatory or stressful for their body while we build them back up.
Right. You know, back in the 90s when I was doing most of my work in LA, we didn't get in so much to elimination diets because it was a clinical-like setting, yet more in a retail space, if you can kind of imagine that, to where we were really a different happening herb store. But we would at least, with everyone, try to stress the fact that their diet really made the herbs work better. And for most of those people, it was just eliminating their junk food was the big deal, because you look at almost anybody's diet, and I still find this today, that a good 30 to 50% of it's not actually food. It's food-like products that they use because they just like the taste of it and it's convenient, but it's not food. But I don't know if you've ever found this, because you're in more of a medical practice, but people used to lie to me about what they ate all the time, because you know how they don't want you to know what they actually do, and it takes 3 or 4 visits before they trust you, and then they really tell you what's going on. My favorite customer was this guy who told me all about all the organic stuff he ate and grass-fed beef, clear back before I even heard of it. He was telling me everything. It was on. And after 3 weeks and he wasn't having anything happening, he told me one day, well, actually, I have soda pop and pretzels for breakfast every day. He didn't eat anything that he had told me he was eating, but he didn't want to look bad, you know. So it was just amazing.
I get some of that, but not much. I think by the time they get to me, they're ready for some help.
They're ready for help.
I think initially that would happen, and initially that would happen early on, or sometimes people aren't very honest about what they're eating. But I think the bigger thing now in Colorado here, it's very, very health focused, health centered. People are pretty serious about it. I don't really have to explain any of the diets that, everybody knows what paleo is. Everybody knows what the SIBO diet is. They're all pretty hip on that. So they know how they should be eating, and maybe they know exactly what to tell me. But the elimination diet we've seen make a huge difference in practice. I always think of supplements as a supplement to your diet, but man, if the diet is not right, people do not get as well as quickly. That's what I've seen.
Yeah, I try to tell people, if your body's continuously using its energy to fight what you put in it, there's nothing left over to correct itself. And
so true.
It takes so much energy to deal with junk, and it takes all your reserves to try and put something into a form that your body can assimilate. If that makes sense, it robs you of nutrition you have stored that could be used for something to deal with your nutrient deficient stuff that you just put in your mouth. And so it's kind of like, getting across to them, it's great to take herbs. I love all the herbs I sell and the things I make, but the reality is, if you don't change something, and this is what health problems really are about, is teaching you that it's time to change something. And so with, for all of our listeners out there who may be having thyroid issues and don't really know it yet, and they're listening to this podcast, what would you say to them to look for that would tell them that they really should come and see someone like you about their thyroid?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, a lot of patients can identify that they're having thyroid, for example, symptoms, even though they're told that their lab work looks normal. And again, I just want to stress that generally the test that is run is TSH, and TSH is only one small part of the equation. You're not looking at the full thing. So symptoms are a pretty good indicator that maybe something's not right with the thyroid. So some of the big thyroid symptoms are cold body temperature, because the thyroid gland is really the metabolic regulator of the body. So like if you step outside and it's cold, it really pumps out thyroid hormone to warm you up. So cold body temperature, cold hands and feet are a big keynote. Hair loss is big. Women really notice when they're pulling out globs of hair. You should lose about 100 hairs on average. But when you're pulling out tons of stuff and noticing even slight balding, but they just notice hair is thinning is the big thing. Inability to lose weight is a huge one, even on a very, very low calorie diet. Women primarily will present with GERD or reflux, or really needing to do antacids. And the reason for that is the thyroid gland regulates a lot of the metabolic function of the body, meaning how all of your enzyme reactions work. So, for example, digesting your food. The thyroid gland is responsible for how fast that happens and how fast food moves through your GI tract. And it's also responsible for making sure that the hydrochloric acid is working. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but right. But you being able to break down your food in a timely manner to make enough hydrochloric acid. If you're constantly burping up your food is just sitting in your stomach, and ultimately that's fermenting. So number one, you're going to have reflux or GERD. Number two, you're going to be constipated. And number three, you're going to have all these food sensitivities because, again, the food is just sitting there fermenting, not moving through the GI tract. And what that does is that creates something we call leaky gut, because it's creating bacteria that's not great. And you get gap junctions that open up, and then that can go into your bloodstream, and your body mounts what we call an immune response. And you start with food sensitivities, and then ultimately it's possible that goes to something more serious like food allergies, which is pretty common. Again, since it does a lot of the rate of the body, the enzymics rate of the body, you'll also notice that you have brain fog because your brain isn't working as fast. And the really cool thing about how our gut and our brain are linked is the bacteria that makes neurotransmitters, like our happy neurotransmitters, our antidepressant neurotransmitters, our motivation neurotransmitters, our memory neurotransmitters. All of that is made in the gut. 90% of that is made in the gut. So when you're talking about serotonin and GABA and dopamine and ACH, all of that's made there. But ultimately, you're going to end up having brain fog because, number one, you're not making those neurotransmitters. And number two, your body isn't absorbing the sugar that it needs to run your brain, the sugar, the fat, and everything else that it needs to run your brain. So you'll see a lot of brain fog. Headaches are common. Aches and pains are another one. Women's menstrual cycles will get interrupted. They'll tend to have heavy periods. They'll tend to have irregular periods. They can be prolonged. On labs, you'll definitely see higher cholesterol levels. Anxiety can be another sign of it. Depression, and pregnancy tends to be inability to get pregnant or inability to stay pregnant tends to be a pretty big driver for women into the practice because they don't know what's going on and they don't want to get on fertility treatments. So those are kind of the big ones, I would say.
Wow. And so when you look at somebody with any of these conditions we're talking about, you can tell that these are not conditions that require drugs. These are conditions that all require lifestyle changes, is looking at what you're eating and what you're actually doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lifestyle is a huge part of it. You want to figure out what's causing your body, for example, to either not function properly or when it gets to autoimmune disease, attack itself and try to figure out what factors are creating that and remove those things and then rebalance the body so that the body can actually function. See, the goal, and I don't know, my goal in practice is to address the problem with, an herb, with diet, and then move forward to the next problem. I want to create long-lasting lifestyle changes, but I do not want to create supplements that people need to be on forever. I want to just put in the input that they need for their body and then be able to have them move forward, right? So that they don't need to be on that long-term, right?
Right.
That's the goal for practice, I think. So the blood work definitely tells us where things are and the symptoms as well. So people will feel great. You can turn blood work around on a lot of things. You can drop the cholesterol 100 points in 3 weeks. It's very quick. Yeah, and it's simple things. You don't even know you're doing it, but it's simple things like diet. Diet will drop it, and just doing a few supplements short term to just help the body actually get back in balance.
Well, what was one of the fascinating things I learned about thyroid a couple of years ago, and we talked about this briefly. I found this book, Why Do I Still Have Thyroid Symptoms When My Lab Tests Are Normal? Mm-hmm. And it was by a Dr. Karazian, and it turned out that he's your mentor.
Datis Karazian. He is fantastic. Yep.
And so this is one of the few books I read that I had a feeling that the guy that read it was a genius and that it was a little above my pay grade, but I was trying to figure it out. But this was the book that actually opened up my mind to the idea that you don't have to just rush in and give a drug for thyroid. It's not just a drug-related illness. It's a stress. He talks about stress in that book and adaptogenic herbs all the time. And it's about trying these other modalities to see if the body actually just comes back into its normal balance.
Absolutely. Yep. Everything. He believes blood sugar is a key component that always needs to be addressed. Cortisol levels, adrenal function. He believes in getting the body back into balance. Yep. And it's so important. And
everything else follows along. This is kind of my idea. If you don't know where to start with most things, regulate somebody's blood sugar. Because if they're out of whack, and that throws the entire body into almost a crisis state, to where it's always operating in a crisis state. And if you can't fix that, you're not going to get very far with almost anything they have going on.
I 100% agree. Blood sugar and anemia are two big key things that have to be addressed. I completely agree. Yep.
Oh, now that you mentioned anemia, I want to ask you something. Do you find do you have much issue with women coming in who are anemic but tend to want to exercise like crazy? And what do you think that does, or how does that influence their heart health long term?
Yeah, I mean, anemia is a big piece. So what I've found with anemia itself is that the patient will exercise like crazy, but they'll be exhausted and they won't be able to do at their peak performance, is what I've seen. And they feel so much better. When it's actually an iron deficiency anemia, they feel so much better when you actually supplement them with iron. I mean, there's multiple forms of anemia. There can be anemia of chronic disease, which happens in autoimmune disease. I mean, again, you have to balance the body back and figure out what's going on. But yeah, with the iron deficiency anemia, a lot of those women just push through. It's primarily found in women. I don't think I've seen an iron deficiency anemia in men. If you do, you should be very concerned. They may have a GI bleed. But yeah, in a menstruating woman, they will push through. They're tough. But yeah, I think ultimately I don't know what the research is on heart health. Sure, it does affect the heart because, again, cardiovascular oxygen carrying capacity is really, really important. But yeah, they do push through.
We used to see this a lot when I worked in the LA area. We had a term for it called yogorexic. Where we we called it yogorexic. And what it was we had a group of women that seemed to take 3 yoga classes a day and only juice and eat at the salad bar. And you could just tell that they were frail and worn out. And if you did your typical, workup, which in Chinese herbology, they were all anemic. Just worn out. They just were not building blood, and they were usually vegan, ate nothing but salads, did classes all day long, and that's where we came up with the yogorexic idea. And in Chinese medicine, it's I remember it was really not beneficial to your overall physical health, especially your heart, if you were anemic and constantly pushing yourself with heavy exercise. It just put a burden on a blood organ, and that was just unnatural, and long term would have many different effects in your system.
For sure, definitely. I mean, what I have seen in practice is if someone is anemic, you can't fix anything in their labs. I mean, you really have to address the anemia first, or else they're going to continue to have, and anemia actually mimics thyroid, right? Because hair loss, you think about it, it's like hair loss, fatigue. It's a mimicker of thyroid. So you want to make sure it's not anemia. You always want to run those tests to check, to see what's going on. And you actually want to run, and my belief is iron panels just to make sure it actually is iron deficiency anemia, because you can have anemia of chronic disease, which is you really need to treat the autoimmune disease first. And they don't. Iron is, if you overgive iron is actually a heavy metal. Okay, so they say iron is more toxic to the human body in excess than lead or mercury. So excess. Yep.
Wow, that's
very,
fascinating.
very common. Yeah.
So
Side note.
Yeah. So what do you think long term, if people just, a lot of people with I'm from the Midwest, just so you know. So in the Midwest, for a man, you usually go to the doctor when you're thinking, well, I could die, or maybe I could just go to the doctor. So then you kind of choose going to the doctor, right? Because it seems less painful. But that's kind of how you grew up in the Midwest. Like my dad went to the doctor like twice in his first 70 years or something, you know. So what happens with people that have thyroid issues long term that just keep ignoring it and putting it off?
Well, first off, I want to say that we call that like eyeball syndrome. Like if when a man comes in and like their wife has made them come in or whatnot, it's kind of like they have an eyeball hanging out and they're like, "Hey doc, can you fix this in one treatment?" Like, no pressure, no pressure at all. Yeah. So long term with thyroid conditions, it ultimately leads to heart failure. It leads to full on autoimmune disease, full on panic attacks. You can see that. These people literally feel like, I've heard people talk about they walk in concrete. They're like walking in concrete. So what you see with someone that's been struggling with it for a long time, they can be pretty desperate. Even if they're medicated, like for hypothyroid, they're medicated. And let's say they have autoimmune disease that hasn't been identified. What I've seen in practice is a lot of times their C-reactive protein, which is an early indicator of cardiovascular function, is off the charts, meaning high, meaning they're at risk for heart disease or have some sort of heavy-duty inflammation. So that's a huge priority to address to get that down. Because really the first symptom of heart disease is a heart attack. That's when most people are like, that's
and half the people
thing. So
half the people don't survive their first symptom.
Right. That's exactly right. So, I mean, you're really far down the line. You see extreme depression. So you see these people be heavily medicated on antidepressants. I've even seen antipsychotics. Long term, again, you'll see bone health be a problem, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis tends to be, I meant osteoporosis, but most of them do have osteoarthritis or arthritis, tends to be another huge health concern. Most of these people haven't slept well. If they have a significant other, their marriage is on the rocks, and they just generally don't feel good. But yeah,
Wow.
Heart disease is a big one. And a lot of this will even go to thyroid cancer. They'll have nodules on their thyroid gland.
When you're talking about all these different issues, flashing through my mind was how many millions of people in typical Western medicine that have these issues going on, because this covers a huge section of the population that never actually get a proper diagnosis and just plod along through life taking a few different drugs, trying to fix something, and they're not even working on the real issue. And they end up just being a mess and thinking, I get this all the time, I was just born defective. They get this idea that they're defective and that it's a genetic issue. And there's nothing to do with it.
My all-time favorite is, I'm just getting older.
Yeah.
That's my all-time favorite. Like, I'm just getting older. Yeah, I can't get out of bed. Yeah, I can't have a normal bowel movement. Yeah, I can't sleep through the night. Yep, this is just a symptom of getting older. I'm like, how sick is our population when this is what we have to look forward to? And the other thing that blows my mind on all of this is, why would you let it get to that point? Why would you not seek help if you're not sleeping through the night? Why would you, if you're noticing heart palpitations or your heart beating out of your chest, like, why wouldn't you go get that addressed? I guess to me, that's confusing.
Yeah, but in typical Western medicine, like, you might go and get a thyroid medication and you feel great for 4 weeks, and then it all just bottoms out again, and they'll tell you to take more, or they'll up the dose, and it's just never really finding the root cause of anything. And again, that's what's so exciting about functional medicine, is knowing that there is new tests that medical doctors don't ever order or even know about, that you can find out the root cause of things.
And I think that's an important point that people don't understand, because people aren't educated that there are other thyroid tests, because their doctors tell them their thyroid test is normal. And, you want to trust your doctor and take him or her at their word. But there are multiple other tests. So I just want to so that people know what to look for on their lab work, just if they're having the symptoms. I just like to read through some of the tests, but it's TSH, which is the normal screening. There's T4 and T3. So those are total T4 and T3. There's free T4, free T3, T3 uptake, reverse T3, and then there are TPO and thyroid antibodies. Wow. So just to make sure that patients know that there could be maybe more to the equation, to double check. And the other thing that has been really, really common among thyroid patients, especially more in the autoimmune piece, but a lot of these patients have trouble methylating. So this has become a hot term about methylated B12 and folic acid, et cetera. But a lot of these patients, this can be a genetic SNP, but a lot of these patients do better with methylated Bs because they don't do as well absorbing their Bs, which ultimately, if you can't convert from homocysteine to B12, that does correlate with heart disease down the line.
Wow. So, well, you just pegged me.
Did I?
You know what? You're talking about this. I want the listeners to know that this can happen to anyone, because I was having a talk with Dr. Ann before we got on about back in the 80s, I was trying to figure out why I was freezing all the time, and I lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and I went to a doctor, and they took my temperature, and then they called in another doctor, and then they took my temperature 4 times while the other doctors and my original doctor just kept looking at each other and talking. I finally said, well, what's going on? She goes, well, we have a problem because according to your temperature, you're supposed to be dead. And but the reason I bring this up, because my temperature was 93, and you're not supposed to have a 93 temperature, right? So,
nope.
So they basically never suggested there was anything wrong with my thyroid because the standard test they gave me was normal. Right. So then the other issue you brought up too is, I'm pretty sure, I don't know if you're familiar with the fact that I had cancer a couple of years ago.
I am.
Okay, so one of the things I did once I got over mine, which was quite miraculous, I was done with it within a couple of months, but I went to a functional medicine practitioner and got a whole slew of tests done, and I was not methylating B vitamins. I was not methylating properly, so I had to change my whole program over to, to make sure that my liver was functioning better, that I was making more glutathione, that I had the right forms of B vitamins. And interestingly enough, there's a famous little vitamin protocol that they give bladder cancer survivors that extends their survival rates. I mean, it's really an amazing leap in years that they survive, and it's just based on methylated Bs and a little bit of vitamin C and vitamin E and selenium. It's not.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was done. I think the research was done out of the University of Texas, and when you look at the formula, it just has some selenium and methylated Bs in it and things.
Yeah.
It wasn't anything.
That is powerful.
But I religiously take those things today.
Yeah, you'll see people just change over from fatigue, and you'll just see numbers fall on blood work, like, for example, with C-reactive protein or homocysteine. It's pretty incredible to see that change, but a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know how important it is, especially if they have the genetic SNP where they're not methylating well. And if you have a thyroid condition, especially autoimmune, I would just bet that you're not methylating well. So, yeah, it's really, really important for overall inflammation. You have to manage that inflammatory piece. So, pretty powerful stuff. Really powerful.
A couple of years ago, I think it's been 2 years now, we changed our one formula, Tian-Chi, to include methylated B12 and methylated folic acid, just because of the fact that, 3 years ago, I had friends that I just recommended some methylated folic acid to, and they called me up like their life had changed in 2 days.
It does, though.
They were like, whoa. So, so now it's so important to your nerve health and to your brain that we just put it in our drink. It was just amazing.
And energy and everything. I mean, you across the board, you name it, it's powerful. Yeah. Very, very powerful.
Isn't it funny that such little simple things can make such an impact on your health? And I tell people this all the time. If you don't think supplements or herbs are powerful, just look at folic acid. The amount of folic acid you take is about the size of a period at the end of a sentence in a newspaper. And that can change everything about your health within a few days. If you're really deficient, you'll feel different. That tiny little thing.
It's awesome. It really is. Yeah, it's simple things make big changes. I mean, I don't know why we've made things so complicated and so not acceptable or not accessible to the population where we have these controlled substances. And sometimes I believe pharmaceuticals are necessary, absolutely, but I believe that they're more of a last-ditch effort. So whatever you can get through naturally first, I mean, you start with smaller guns, and then if you need to work up to big guns, that's one thing, but you should always start smaller versus hitting it with a huge gun initially. That's
sure. There are many times when Western drugs are what you have to do at the moment.
Absolutely.
But I try to tell people, especially with things like high blood pressure, if you're at the point where you're 180 over 140, you better go get something, right? But that should just be a reason for you to study and find someone that can figure out what your problem is, so that 30 to 60 days from now, you're not doing that.
So that you can actually lower it, right? And figure out what the cause is. And why is it up?
Find out what the cause is and remove the agitators from your diet and your lifestyle and let your body even itself out. So,
yeah, I totally agree. It's pretty powerful stuff.
So in your practice, do you have any herbs that you actually recommend for autoimmune issues or thyroid issues?
Yeah, I do. My biggest one to calm down the autoimmune system, I'm a huge fan of glutathione. So glutathione is a very, very powerful antioxidant that's made by the liver. So it's actually made in your body. One thing that we see that could be loss of, for example, glutathione is loss of smell, or not having or being incredibly chemical sensitive. The person that can't sit in the room with somebody with a fragrance on, or it just drives them out of the room, or any chemical smell, they tend to have lowered glutathione. It doesn't have to be that, but it's commonly a good place to start. But yeah, I do a lot of glutathione to initially calm down the immune system. It depends on the case. I figure out where the immune system is weak. So it can be, I can either stimulate the Th1 or Th2 system in the immune system. That's all very complicated. But I basically will do a challenge to see what they respond to. So I do that, and then I will kill off, if I think Epstein-Barr is a big component of it, I will I'll use biofilm killers to get rid of Epstein-Barr as well, to help to mitigate that. I'll also do very high dose vitamin C, like a liquid form of vitamin C, which mimics intravenous vitamin C or an IV. So they call it liposomal vitamin C. So I'll do high doses of that. The literature states to really calm down an Epstein-Barr infection, it can take up to 10 rounds of it. They've seen antibodies drop pretty substantially with the Epstein-Barr virus. And I notice a lot less aches and pains in the patient system. I don't think I've ever gotten to 10 rounds of it. But wow. But 5 is possible.
So what is considered a round?
I'm sorry, a round. I about 5.
About 5
of it. Oh,
okay.
Oh, so yeah, I do a supplement that's just liposomal. So each time I do one of those, I consider that a round.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. So 5 doses of vitamin C. What I really end up doing is I'll do biofilm killers, which is something like serapeptidase and monolaurin is generally what I have found effective for one round of that. And then I'll do high dose vitamin C depending on how they respond to that. So I'll change the protocol and dance with that a little bit to see what's working with them. But so I will do that once they get stable enough, once I've calmed the autoimmune flares. Diet's a big part of my practice. Depending on so when you're looking at the thyroid gland, some people aren't detoxifying, like, for example, estrogens or xenoestrogens, what we're exposed to. I generally treat the liver in all thyroid conditions. I find that's really, really important to make sure that the liver is functioning because T4 to T3 is generally converted in the liver, and that makes people feel pretty good. Sometimes I will do thyroid, like a bovine thyroid, depending on what has gone awry with the thyroid gland. Sometimes turmeric and resveratrol. So it just depends on where the primary source is. But like we've talked about before, blood sugar is huge in thyroid cases. Huge. Blood sugar, liver, digestive health. Sometimes I'll do neurotransmitters, but blood sugar, I almost always treat.
Right. With me, because I have a different business, I'm not a clinic anymore. I don't have walk-in clients or I'm not set up to do that. But I do give advice to our clients that, ask for it, who find us through our website and stuff, because we're a anti-stress brain company, right? Brain Essentials. And so I do end up talking to a lot of people, and what I tell them, especially if I have an idea that they're dealing with autoimmune conditions, is that number one, you have to clean up your diet because we mentioned this earlier about how leaky gut causes inflammatory conditions. And if you have to remove the things that are responsible for that and that are the easiest things for your body to actually utilize to make energy and to heal itself. And at the same time, deal with your stress, because stress is the big issue. I remember back when I was still working a lot in LA that we always used to almost laugh. We'd have to sneak an anti-stress formula into their program, because back then in the 90s, it was considered an insult to tell somebody they were stressed. Right. Whereas today, everybody wants to let you know they're stressed so they belong to a bigger club. Right. But they don't want to be left out. Right. But back then it was like you were insulting people. So we would sneak something in. And if they took it and dealt with their stress, the next time we saw them, they had half as many problems.
Right.
Because
that's so true.
It's true. And because stress, it just shuts off half of your digestion, your nervous system. When it's peaked, your body cannot regroup. It cannot heal from anything. And it puts such a tremendous amount of stress on your adrenals, your thyroid, every gland in your body. So that's kind of how we look at it. And, we're big, we're the adaptogenic herb company, so we're big on that approach to calming people. And I tell people, if you can deal with your stress and clean up your diet, then you'll know where you're at within 30 days. I mean, literally, it gives you a whole different idea of what your health is like, and start finding that place to get some help.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And what's also interesting is at this point, when I first started practice, I've been in practice for 10 years now. When I first started practice, the problems that were prevalent then are not the same ones that are prevalent now. Stress has completely amplified it. And I would say 90% of my new functional chemistry cases, they don't sleep. Most people do not sleep anymore. Insomnia is a huge issue, and their mind is racing. They're going through their checklists, they're going through their to-do list. They're waking up in the middle of the night. And if you don't sleep, you don't heal anything.
You don't deal with anything.
Yeah, I mean, you think about what that does to your brain. You think about brain fog. I mean, your body can't clean up the damage from the day. It's just one of our first priorities, especially when someone comes in and they have insomnia, is to make sure that we get them sleeping, to remove whatever it is that's causing a sleep issue, or try to get to the bottom of that. Because cleaning up your diet, fixing your sleep, a lot of things clean up themselves. And then you actually, exactly what you said, find out what is really, really left there, and then address those main points.
Yeah, it was fascinating when I first got into Chinese herbs. They had different ways of looking at insomnia. Some of it was what they called heart yin deficiency. You had a inner fire, heat that was agitating your heart. But the other ones were basically blood deficiency. Mm-hmm. And if you have blood deficiency, what they call heart blood deficiency, you would be that person who would lay there all night thinking about what they had to do the next day, what they didn't get done that day, and what they were supposed to be doing, and they couldn't fall asleep. So that probably dovetails right into the blood deficiency, anemic thyroid issues we were talking about earlier too.
It's so common today. It's become so much more common. What do you think would cause that to become more common with a blood deficiency nowadays versus back 10 years ago?
I think that people, as they become more aware of different ways of eating, become a little bit, how would you call it, almost religious in the way that they eat. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those diets don't necessarily promote building blood. Mm-hmm. I know, so there's certain diets that, like, I remember back when I got into the health industry back in the early 80s, there was the beginning of the raw food craze. And raw food's really good for you, but it's not the best diet to be on if you're anemic, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. It's just really hard for a lot of people who have digestive issues to build blood on a raw food diet. But it doesn't mean you can't have a good proportion of it in there, along with something else that's easier to digest and easier to build blood. But I think maybe, there's a couple issues here, but it comes back to food. One is that a lot of society is eating so much fast food and they don't make food themselves. And then there's this segment where you just get regimented into only eating certain foods, and you don't really broaden your approach to food. So, and then there's stress. I mean, when you have stress, like everybody does these days, you just can't gloss over the fact that your digestion never fully turns on, and you're not going to be absorbing the nutrients out of your food.
Exactly. Yep. You cannot break your food down. So bad. And then those big pieces of food go into your digestive tract or your small intestines undigested, and then we have, leaky gut, and we have all these food sensitivities. I mean, when we'll run tests for food sensitivities, for example, I mean, some of the stuff that comes back is just like, what in the world? Broccoli, carrots, all these things. And it's just things that people are eating on a regular basis because they're not digesting and breaking down the food. These foods aren't bad. It's just that they can't absorb or break down anything that they're eating. And so they're ending up in the bloodstream and becoming visible on a blood test for these food sensitivity tests. So it's just silly. Until you can heal up the gut, I don't recommend my patients get these initial food sensitivity tests. That's just how I've run the practice.
Well, that's a great idea because, years ago I started to see this and tell people that if you're coming back from your doctor and he tells you there's 75 things you can't eat, it's probably not a case of being allergic to those things. It's a case of just having really terrible digestion. And you have to fix it because you cannot be allergic to that many common foods. It's just
right.
There's something else going on.
And if you want to step that up to even another level, something else that I have found out in the years of running these tests is if someone's immune system is overactive or underactive, you're either going, if it's overactive, you're going to show up sensitive to, all the foods. So I remember getting one food sensitivity test back, and I'm looking at this, and I went in with the patient and I told them, I'm not even going to tell you about your food sensitivity test, because I'm not even going to show it to you because it is so ridiculous. It basically all you can eat is cheese on this thing, and you can have some carrots. And I'm just not. I mean, everything came back positive. It was ridiculous. So I called the company that had administered the test, and they're like, "Oh yeah, if your patient is, actively fighting off an infection, it's going to show basically a hyper response in the immune system, and it's potential that the immune system is reacting to everything."
Right.
And I'm like, well, clearly that's what's going on. And then to further that, they're like, well, and if the immune system is depressed, or if the patient's been under stress for a long period of time, then the test may come back with nothing wrong.
Right.
I'm like, how accurate is this?
Wow.
Because that's the entire population is one of those two things.
Well, that's what makes it so important that they find somebody like you to actually help them figure that out. A lot of times, because I'm an herbalist and I'm in the health field, I tend to have this idea that I'll just figure everything out on my own. It doesn't actually work out that way. Right? But I will tell you, people are listening. Don't discount the fact that removing certain foods from your diet can't make a big impact, because I'm a gluten-free guy. I don't eat gluten. Right. Maybe 3 times a year now I'll eat some fermented bread, and it doesn't tend to bother me at all. Mm-hmm. But back when I started this gluten-free diet, I did it because I had broken my hand this was 10 years before I had symptoms, something like that, 10 or 15 years. And it never bothered me. And one day I woke up and my hand was useless. It hurt so bad I couldn't button my shirt. I couldn't stick my hand in my pocket to get a quarter out of it, right? Mm-hmm. And so I went through all kinds of things I was trying. And 4 months later, I had this useless hand that hurt all the time. And somebody suggested, my naturopathic doctor, the guy who actually finally figured out I had low thyroid, he told me to just...
Amen for that.
He just told me to try not eating wheat for 30 days. So, okay, well, right. When you first do that, you think you're going to die, because that's bread and pizza. And, it's just easy to always have these things, right? So... But I did it, and I happened to go to a yoga weekend with my wife, who is helping teach this Kundalini yoga weekend. And I did this extensive, really hard yoga for a whole weekend, and I realized I didn't have any joint pain very much at all, right? So
Incredible.
when I go, it must be the diet. So I just stayed off of gluten for another about 3 months. So it came out to about 4 months. And right about at the end of 4 months, I woke up one day and my hand didn't hurt anymore. And my hand is not hurt now for over 9 years. Mm-hmm. And up until then, I literally couldn't button a shirt with it. And now It's normal. And that was all just from going off of gluten.
Yeah. My Achilles heel was dairy. So dairy is my Satan's bride for sure. And this was interesting. When I was in college, during finals time, I basically looked like a creature out of Star Wars. I had hives. I itched, and I was vain in the day, and so that was not great. And the hives actually started swelling up in my throat, in which ultimately what can happen is that can restrict your breathing. So I found myself going to the emergency room multiple times, because clearly I was Benadryl deficient, right? And anyway, no one ever talked to me about diet. No one ever talked to me about, stress. And I've theorized, finally somebody in the alternative medicine field talked to me about, potentially that is dietary related, and removed me off dairy. And once I quit dairy, the hives went away. And again, it was also during finals time. So, that dairy with that stress. So I think it was a combination of those two things, but it actually sent me into an anaphylactic episode. And to me, it was just crazy that no one talked to me about that. And I felt like alternative medicine had changed my life. And that's when I ended up in this field, because I could never get help through Western medicine. And so this has ultimately been my path. So I wanted to help people that also fell into the gray zone, that couldn't get help but had symptoms. But, we're told they were totally normal by medicine standards. So,
well,
yeah.
Just so the listeners know out there, most of us people that are into alternative medicine are people that have suffered, had to figure out their own conditions and wanted to help people. That's how we all get into it. I remember one of my teachers telling me, you're going to be really good. You've had so much pain and suffering in your life.
That's right.
You're going to be good at helping people figure this out. And when you were telling your story about the dairy, it reminded me, this is almost comical. I was in the hospital in Hawaii. I got hit by a truck on my bicycle, and I was in the hospital for 8 days. I had a lot of stuff broken and a lot of, it was just a mess. But the second day I was in there, they wheeled this big Samoan guy into my room. It was in Maui. And he comes in, he's, a typical Samoan guy, really big, and he's in bed, and I ask him what he's in for, and he goes, well, I went into shock watching TV, and it's the third time in the last 2 months that I went into shock and almost had a heart attack. They thought I was dying. They took me to the hospital in an ambulance, and no one's been able to figure out what's going on. And so he's laying there, and they bring in this big bowl of ice cream to give him. Right. And I'm looking at him. I said, what were you doing the other 3 times that you went into shock? He goes, well, I was just watching TV and eating ice cream. And then he looked down at his bowl and he looked at me and he goes, oh, crap. Like this, right? and so he called the nurses in and had him run a test for dairy allergies, and it was the ice cream that was sending him into shock. He goes, my God, I'm so glad. He says to me, this is the funny part, I'm so glad you got hit by that truck, or I'd have never met you in there. He says.
You're like, oh, me too.
Oh yeah, me too. But hey, I saved your life. What the heck, Well,
that's huge, though.
It is huge. It probably changed the whole course of his life. So. It wasn't a bad
that
thing.
Story somewhere too.
Yeah, he's probably still telling it. Well, Dr. Ann, I'm going to kind of wrap it up. I think we touched on a lot of amazing information.
I agree.
And one thing we didn't do enough of, though, although we'll write it up when we send out the email to announce this, is your website. So.
Oh, sure.
And what is that? You want to tell us what it is?
So the name of my practice is Alternative Family Medicine. So it's shortened. So it's www.altfam.med, med. That's www.altfammed.
All right. And so I want to thank you for being on today. I think it went really well, and I think this is going to be an incredible podcast when we release it. And I had a lot of fun doing it, and I want to thank you for coming on and sharing all this great information that you gave us today.
Me too. Thank you so much. This was a blast. I really enjoyed it. And thanks for taking the time and having me on.
All right. I think we probably are going to have to do this again sometime.
That sounds great.
But anyway, well, have a great rest of your day, and thanks again for being on.